We've already told you what happened to Persephone. We've already told you what it meant to Hades. We've never told you what it did to her mother. Demeter's grief didn't just produce a sad poem passed down through the centuries. It stopped the harvest of the entire world, brought humanity to the edge of extinction, and forced Zeus himself to reverse a decision he'd already made and finalized. This is the goddess whose sorrow was strong enough to threaten every other god's survival right along with it, proof that in this pantheon, grief and power were never actually separate things. Demeter was one of the 6 children of Kronos and Rhea, swallowed at birth alongside her siblings, and freed by Zeus during the Titanomachy, the same overthrow this channel already covered in the Kronos episode. Where Zeus took the sky, Poseidon the sea, and Hades the underworld, Demeter's share of the world was quieter but no less load-bearing. Agriculture, the harvest, and the grain, every mortal civilization in this mythology depends on to survive. Her power was never about spectacle. It was about whether anyone got to eat at all. Compare her portfolio to her brothers directly. Zeus governs through visible authority, Poseidon through volatile force, Hades through cosmic law nobody can see enforced. Demeter's domain stays invisible right up until it stops working. Nobody thinks of the harvest as a form of power until the harvest fails. This channel already covered the abduction itself in detail, from both Hades' side and Persephone's, so here's the short version told from Demeter's angle. Her daughter vanished from a field of flowers in an instant, with no witness, no explanation, and no trace. Demeter didn't see it happen. She simply noticed at some point that her daughter was gone, and that gap between disappearance and discovery is where this episode actually begins. The Homeric hymn to Demeter, the primary ancient source for this entire myth, lingers on that gap specifically, describing Demeter hearing a single distant scream and feeling something break inside her before she even understands what's happened. A mother's instinct registering the loss before the facts catch up to it. For 9 days, Demeter wandered the earth without eating, drinking, or bathing, carrying torches to search through the night as well as the day. She questioned everyone she encountered and got almost nothing useful back, until Hecate, goddess of the crossroads, told her she'd heard Persephone's cries but hadn't seen who took her. It was Helios, the sun god who sees everything from above, who finally told Demeter the truth. Hades had taken her, with Zeus's own permission, without so much as consulting the mother whose daughter it was. That detail recontextualizes the entire myth. Demeter isn't just grieving a disappearance. She's discovering that the people she should have been able to trust most, her own brothers, had already agreed to her daughter's fate behind her back. Grief-stricken and furious at Zeus, Demeter disguised herself as an old woman and wandered to the city of Eleusis, where the royal family, not recognizing her, hired her as a nurse for their infant son, Demophoon. Grateful for their kindness, Demeter tried to make the child immortal, feeding him ambrosia by day and secretly holding him in the hearth fire each night to burn away his mortality. She was interrupted mid-ritual by the boy's horrified mother, who screamed at the sight of her son in the flames. Furious at the interruption, Demeter revealed her true divine form on the spot and demanded a temple be built in her honor, the same temple that would go on to host the Eleusinian Mysteries. It's a strange, easily overlooked detail sitting in the middle of this myth. Before Demeter ever gets her own daughter back, she nearly succeeds in giving another woman's son the one thing she can't yet secure for Persephone: permanent freedom from death. Before we get to exactly how far Demeter was willing to go to get her daughter back, hit subscribe now so you don't miss it. With her daughter still missing and her grief now turned to open rage, Demeter withdrew her power from the earth entirely. Crops stopped growing, fields turned barren. Ancient sources describe a famine severe enough that humanity itself stood on the edge of extinction, and because mortals were starving, they stopped making sacrifices and offerings to the gods too, meaning Demeter's grief was starting to starve Olympus's own authority right along with humanity. This wasn't a private sorrow contained to one goddess. It was an event that threatened the entire structure the gods depended on to matter at all. There's a real irony buried in this standoff. The gods who claim ultimate authority over the universe turn out to depend on mortal worship to sustain that authority, meaning a single grieving mother, acting entirely alone, came closer to unmaking the Olympian order than any war this pantheon had fought up to that point. Zeus, watching his own authority collapse along with the harvest, finally intervened and ordered Hades to return Persephone. This channel already covered the pomegranate seed trick from Hades' side, 6 seeds eaten, 6 months owed every year. From Demeter's side, the compromise reads less like a clean resolution and more like a partial victory forced onto a mother who, by this point, had been willing to let the entire world starve rather than accept less. The seasons themselves become the physical record of that unresolved anger. Growth and abundance when her daughter is home, barrenness and cold for the months she isn't. The temple Demeter demanded at Eleusis became the site of ancient Greece's most secretive and most important religious rites, held annually for roughly 2,000 years. Initiates were sworn to absolute secrecy about what actually happened inside, a vow so thoroughly kept that modern scholars still don't know the specific rituals performed, only that participants were promised a better fate in the afterlife for taking part. People took part across the centuries this rite ran, from ordinary citizens to, by some accounts, Roman emperors, meaning whatever happened inside that temple was considered essential enough to draw people across enormous differences in status, all keeping the exact same silence afterward. It's one of the only ancient religious practices this channel can describe the importance of without being able to describe the actual content of, because the people who experienced it kept that promise for 2,000 years. What ancient sources do agree on is the outline around the secret itself. Initiates fasted, walked in procession from Athens to Eleusis, and drank a barley and mint beverage called kykeon before entering a purpose-built hall known as the telesterion, where a hereditary priestly family, the Eumolpidae, presided over the unseen rites as Hierophant, a title that literally means the one who shows the sacred things. Whatever was shown inside that hall stayed inside it, generation after generation, for the entire length of antiquity. Demeter's own myths don't stop at grief. Hesiod records a much stranger episode. In a thrice-plowed field at a wedding feast, Demeter lay with a mortal man named Iasion, and from that union she bore Plutus, whose name simply means wealth, the god of agricultural abundance and prosperity. Zeus, hearing of it, struck Iasion dead with a thunderbolt out of jealousy, the same fate that meets several mortals across this mythology who got too close to a god's favor. It's a detail modern retellings almost never include, and it complicates the grieving mother image this myth usually gets reduced to. Demeter wasn't only a mother defined by loss. She was also, by her own choice, a source of abundance and a lover in her own right, capable of producing life and wealth from the same ground she could just as easily starve. An older, stranger tradition, recorded by the geographer Pausanias, gives Demeter an entirely different kind of encounter with one of her own brothers. Grieving for Persephone and trying to avoid Poseidon's pursuit, Demeter transformed herself into a mare and hid among the horses of Arcadia. Poseidon wasn't fooled. He transformed himself into a stallion and caught her anyway. From that union came Arion, a horse fast enough to talk, later given to the hero Adrastus and credited with saving his life at Thebes, and by some versions, a daughter as well, whose name was considered too sacred to say aloud outside the Arcadian mystery cult that worshipped her. In this region, Demeter wasn't worshipped as the gentle grain goddess most people picture. She was worshipped under the name Demeter Erinis, Demeter the Fury, a title that has nothing gentle about it at all. Once Persephone was returned and the famine lifted, Demeter didn't simply walk away from Eleusis. She chose a mortal prince, Triptolemus, taught him the secrets of agriculture, and sent him out across the entire world in a chariot pulled by winged serpents to teach every civilization he encountered how to grow grain. Every culture in the ancient Mediterranean that farmed the way Demeter taught them owed that knowledge, according to this myth, to one goddess and one chosen mortal messenger. It's the detail that turns Demeter's story from a private family tragedy into something closer to civilization building, the same scale of consequence, usually reserved for a Zeus or a Prometheus, credited instead to a goddess most modern retellings shrink down to a footnote. The Eleusinian Mysteries weren't the only major religious festival Demeter's myth produced. Across the Greek world, married citizen women held a separate, women-only festival called the Thesmophoria. 3 days of fasting, ritual obscenity, and sacrifice, timed to the sowing season and tied directly to Persephone's descent and return. Men were barred entirely, on pain of death in some accounts, making it one of the only major religious institutions in the ancient Greek world run and attended exclusively by women, with no male priesthood involved at any stage. Piglets were sacrificed and left to decompose in underground pits. Then the rotted remains were dug up months later and mixed into the seed grain, a fertility rite tying Demeter's own domain of decay and rebirth directly into the physical act of farming. Athens alone shut down its civic business for the length of the festival to let it happen. A goddess most people reduced to a sad mother about the seasons was, in practice, powerful enough to pause an entire city's government twice a year. Modern retellings tend to frame this entire story as a grieving mother narrative and stop there, sympathetic, but small in scale. Ancient sources present something closer to a demonstration of raw power, a goddess whose personal sorrow was capable of nearly ending human civilization, forcing the king of the gods to reverse a decision he'd already finalized. Of every god on this channel, Demeter may hold the most consequential single grudge in the entire mythology, not because she commanded armies or thunderbolts, but because she controlled whether anyone got to eat. It's worth asking why this version softens so consistently in modern retellings. A goddess willing to starve the world rather than compromise, and who also took mortal and divine lovers entirely on her own terms, doesn't fit neatly into the gentle, nurturing mother archetype most adaptations reach for by default. So the actual scale of what she was willing to do and who she actually was tends to get quietly trimmed away. Demeter's Roman name, Ceres, gives us the modern word cereal, a small piece of her still sitting on breakfast tables every single day without most people realizing it. Her myth explains the seasons in a way still taught in classrooms as one of the defining stories of Greek mythology. And yet the version most people know stops at goddess is sad. Seasons change, without ever mentioning the famine that nearly ended humanity, the secret rites that shaped 2,000 years of Greek religious life, or the far stranger myths sitting just outside the popular version of her story. Next, the god born twice, raised in disguise, and dangerous enough that an entire city once tore its own king apart rather than admit he was real. Dionysus is next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.